This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. Seeking the truth is not seeking what is desirable. There are few philosophers I get asked to cover on this channel more than the French absurdist Albert Camus. The phrase, "imagine Sisyphus happy," pops up in comment sections all across the internet, and an enormous number of people consider Camus' philosophy of absurdism as the final answer to questions of meaning and personal value. But despite this, I notice many people, myself included, often caricature or oversimplify his views. So today, I thought I would do something a little bit different. I want to present Camus' ideas with a particular focus on what people tend to miss out. Specifically, I want to explore the differences between his early philosophy, which most of you will probably already be familiar with, and his later ideas, which are far less appreciated, but represent the culmination of those earlier themes. By the end of this video, I hope you will have a deeper appreciation for the nuances of absurdist thought, and have some popular myths about Camus dispelled for good. As always, I cannot cover every aspect of Camus' thought here, and I will be prioritizing those areas which I think often get skimmed over. I also definitely want to acknowledge the influence of John Foley's book, Albert Camus, From the Absurd to Revolt, as this has been critical to my own understanding of absurdism and the progression of Camus' thought over time. So, let's start with the cornerstone of Camus' earlier and later philosophy, the concept of the absurd. 1. The absurd, a brief introduction. Out of all the confusions around Camus' philosophy, a large amount stem from a misunderstanding of what he means by the word absurd. And to be fair, this does not come from nowhere, because Camus does use the term in a number of different ways. Sometimes he references the absurd as a state of the universe, and sometimes he talks about the awareness of the absurd as a kind of distinct state of mind we can be in, and sometimes he talks about them as a conflict of the two, and these three concepts are very easy to conflate. The thing that marks Camus out from many of his predecessors is the meaninglessness of the world is not his conclusion, but his starting point. Rather than his characters or his essays culminating in the realization that the world is empty and uncaring, the awareness is there from the beginning, and his work instead focuses on just how to deal with this. Importantly, for him, the realization of life's pointlessness is not a mistake, but a genuine leap forward in someone's thinking. Before Camus, a lot of existential philosophy tacitly assumed that life did in fact have meaning, and that when someone had an existential crisis, they had temporarily failed to see that meaning in some way. We see this theme in Kierkegaard and Tolstoy, but it arguably culminates in the work of Lev Shestov, who says that if clinging to reason brings with it the notion that life is meaningless, then so much the worse for reason. Hence his phrase, "What does Athens, i.e. logic, have to do with Jerusalem, i.e. faith?" In Camus' view, existentialism before him was largely concerned with dispelling life's meaninglessness. There would be some way to re-imbue the world with objective, transcendental value. This is often done via a leap of faith, normally into believing in some kind of deity. But Camus was totally dissatisfied with this approach. He called it philosophical because he saw it as throwing away your reason in order to believe something that you know is not true. Likewise, he saw Jean-Paul Sartre's Marxist-tinged existentialism as turning a particular view of history into a sort of god and following that. Personally, I have some reservations about his interpretations of these thinkers, but this was how Camus saw things. And so we come to the absurd. Camus ultimately defines the absurd as not the fact that life is meaningless, but rather the conflicts between life's lack of intrinsic meaning and our human need for the universe to have some meaning. Unsurprisingly, this conflict is most clear at the moment of an existential crisis, or what Camus calls the sudden awareness of the absurd. For Camus, this feeling of the absurd can strike us at any moment, but there are a few things that often bring it on. The death of a loved one, the repetition of an insignificant routine for years on end, or just some sudden change. But the feeling it results in is pretty consistent. Nothing about your external life may change. You will still act in almost exactly the same way, do the same things and see the same people, but your attitude to them would have subtly changed. Rather than being enmeshed in your life, you will be alienated from it. You will feel like a stranger in the world. This old routine that seemed so significant just no longer feels like it matters. Your entire life almost seems like a play. People are mouthing the words and performing the actions, but it's all vaguely pretend. Above all, the little dishonesties of life are revealed. Camus draws particular attention to how strange social conventions will now seem. Most of his absurd heroes, though they do differ in many respects, share a bewilderment at the mores of the society in which they live. Meursault in The Stranger is even doomed by this inability to pay respect to the conventions of French Algerian society. When he is put on trial for murder, it is ultimately not this that condemns him to execution. It is rather the character witnesses who note that he did not show emotion at his mother's funeral and his general disregard for religion. Camus thinks that at the advent of a crisis like this, many people simply fall into despair or even decide to take their own lives. Even more follow the path of philosophical suicide and leap into faith. But Camus wanted to explore if we could live, as he puts it, without hope and without appeal. Now, this is where many people, myself included, are guilty of oversimplifying Camus' position. When I have talked about his philosophy previously, I've described his preferred reaction to the absurd as just letting go of that human need for meaning that causes the absurd to have its distressing impact on us. If we can unlearn this desire for purpose, then we could be happy with life's emptiness. But on reflection, I don't think this does the particularities of Camus' philosophy justice. After all, many before Camus have talked about lessening our desires to achieve peace and happiness. If Schopenhauer, the Stoics, or the Buddha approached the problem of the absurd, then they would probably recommend this lessening of desire path. But looking at the actual text of the myth of Sisyphus, I think we see something slightly different. To quote directly from the essay, "One of the only coherent philosophical positions is revolt. It is a constant confrontation between man and his own obscurity." To me, this simply does not read as a passive letting go of a need for meaning, though it does involve recognizing that there is no ultimate purpose to life. Camus talks a lot about holding the absurd in our awareness as we live and calls this lucidity. But if the absurd is the contradiction between our wish for meaning and the universe's emptiness, then this awareness cannot simply consist of being aware of the meaninglessness of life, but the meaninglessness of life coupled with the human desire for transcendent meaning. It is thus not just recognizing the emptiness of the world, but also the dissatisfaction and suffering this brings not only to us, but to all those who become aware of this emptiness. I want to point this out because this suffering component is much more prominent in Camus' later works, where he emphasizes human solidarity in the face of it. We'll discuss that in more detail later in the video, but I just wanted to lay a bit of foreshadowing here. The idea of making peace with life's meaninglessness makes it sound like Camus' philosophy is a matter of passive acceptance, when I think little could be further from the truth. In fact, the notions of revolt and rebellion are huge, often overlooked components of his thought in the popular sphere. But I am getting ahead of myself again. The important thing to note is that Camus' entire philosophy rests on this foundation, that we must live our lives in full knowledge of the absurd in order to be philosophically consistent. For him, it is just the only honest way to live. It means that we will neither end our own lives nor embrace faith, but find ways to live that keep this eternal contradiction of human existence forever in our view. But again, much of the popular writing about Camus online ends here. We must live aware of the emptiness of our own lives. This is incredibly easy to say, but much harder to do, and it's also quite light on detail. But both in The Myth of Sisyphus and in his literary works, Camus outlines a number of ways this absurd hero might manifest, and some of them are surprisingly dark. So, I'd like to explore some of these now. But before moving on, I want to take a quick moment to thank our very kind sponsors for this video, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real pain. First, you have to find a domain name and then construct the entire website, and there is always this underlying fear that you are messing up and creating something that is not just messy, but outright unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that complexity into a single platform and use templates to take most of the complication and headache out of website building. They also have a feature called Design Intelligence, which uses AI tools to help you make design choices, which is very handy if, like me, you are not technologically gifted, nor do you have the mind of a graphic designer. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a domain name or a website. But anyway, back to the video. 2. The absurd hero. Solitary Beginnings. Though we now think of Camus as a philosopher, in his own time he was probably more well known as a novelist, a playwright, and a writer, and it is through this fiction that we get some idea of what living in awareness of the absurd actually looks like. And we can hopefully debunk some real caricatures of absurdism that have emerged over the years. The first thing Camus notes about the absurd hero is that they must not value one situation or experience over another in itself. If their chosen task is to exist and live in full knowledge of life's meaninglessness, then they must value not the quality of life, but the quantity of it. Camus' definition of quantity here encompasses both the sheer length of time someone lives, but also the extent to which they remain aware of the absurd, or, in Camus' terms, how lucid they are. In The Myth of Sisyphus, Camus outlines a number of different archetypes of an absurd hero, but he also explicitly refuses to endorse them. He wanted them to be illustrations of what living for the quantity of life looked like, rather than role models. He retells the story of Don Juan as a man who lives this life without any hope of another one, and extends his love to all who will have it, eventually ending his life in contemplation and asceticism, all the time rebelling against pointlessness by committing to action and life despite it. There is the actor, who lives many lives on the stage in full consciousness that they are simply performing, yet extends that performance to their own existence, living their own life as if it were a play. And there is the conqueror, who both acknowledges that their conquering is meaningless, but nonetheless decides to conquer both the world and themselves, to act as if it all matters, while fully aware that it does not. For both Don Juan and the conqueror, they arguably commit quite destructive actions, and I'm not sure that Camus would like them, but they are still living in accordance with the absurd. In fact, Camus says they are good examples of this because their extreme commitment to actions in the world contrasts with their total awareness of the pointlessness of those actions. At this point, Camus' absurd man or absurd hero is not necessarily someone we would call kind or admirable, they are simply someone who lives in lucidity of the absurd. In Camus' early work, the absurd hero is also characterized by solitude and alienation from those around them. This is clearest in The Stranger, where Marceau is set apart from the rest of society by his refusal to lie and to see the meaning in all of their social games, even to the point where he outright murders someone. His total indifference to the quality of life estranges him from others. We also see it in Camus' first novel, A Happy Death, where the protagonist eventually finds this happy death he seeks at the very moment where he feels most isolated from everyone else. Physically, emotionally, and ultimately philosophically. At this moment in Camus' writings, he emphasizes the distaste he feels for the unwillingness of society to acknowledge the absurd, and so his absurd heroes must therefore be by themselves, either literally, as in A Happy Death, or simply psychologically, as in The Stranger. At this point, it is easy to think that Camus straightforwardly endorses all of these heroes, including their ability to seemingly kill without remorse or thought. However, as John Foley has pointed out, Camus is well aware of the darker potential of absurdism, and this comes out most clearly in his very underrated play Caligula. Here, we follow the Roman Emperor Caligula as he descends into tyranny after the death of his sister Drusilla. Caligula has an absurd realization that life is truly pointless, that there are no transcendent values, and that everyone is ultimately going to die and become nothing. But rather than the indifference of someone like Marceau, this prompts him to kill in large numbers with total impunity. If life is pointless, then nothing is forbidden, and so every action is available, even up to and including massacres. So Caligula has no problem becoming a tyrant and a monster. He embraces freedom and power as his own rebellion against the world's emptiness. And in turn, he is assassinated by a group of conspirators led by their own semi-absurd hero, who says that he will kill Caligula, even though he's not sure whether he can consistently morally condemn him. He even concedes that the dictator is totally logical. I wanted to talk about this because it's easy to see Camus as celebrating the absurd hero for their own sake, but I think that it is much more complex than that. In Caligula, we see someone who does live in full knowledge of the absurd, and yet they are indisputably the villain of the piece. Caligula is not presented as misunderstood like Marceau, but rather as someone whose absurdism has truly raged out of control. We see Camus battling with a potential contradiction at the heart of his philosophy. We might call it an absurdist problem of evil. Camus wants to find a way to live in full knowledge of the absurd, yet he knows that this will abolish all transcendent morality. If there is no meaning to anything, then, to quote Camus himself, all consequences are equivalent. But then, on what basis do we say one thing is desirable and another undesirable? How do we stand up to someone like Caligula, who commits atrocities yet in no way contradicts the realization that life is meaningless? How can Camus have absurdism without it devolving into psychopathy? We notice this even more in how he treats the solitary heroes of his later works. In The Fall, we meet Jean-Baptiste Clément, who had an existential crisis and subsequently retreated from the world, becoming a judge penitent, judging other people while admitting that he too is guilty in a world that simply cannot be redeemed. But rather than the defiant tone of Meursault or the triumphant notes of the absurd heroes in the myth of Sisyphus, Clément comes across as just despondent. His solitary approach has not let him live actively in spite of the absurd, but has rather stripped his life of any subjective joy and also made him fragile in the face of suffering. I think this perfectly illustrates Camus' changing attitude with how to approach the absurd. Whereas in his early writings he did endorse a solitary standpoint in the absurdist life, he eventually seemed to become convinced that this was insufficient. In Caligula, he saw a solitary absurdist who nonetheless came to spite his own life and those of others. And later in Clément, he saw how solitude did not bring him freedom and clarity, but rather despair and a hatred of his own existence. And I don't think Camus' eventual critique of a solitary absurdist life came from morality, but more from practicality. It is not that he abandoned his prior conviction that there were no universal values in an absurd world, but rather that certain courses of action simply brought misery to the actor, and living in hostility and total separation from our fellow human beings is just one of these. But then, this begs an obvious question. What was Camus' later conception of absurd heroism, and how does it compare to his earlier one? Well, it's almost as if you read my mind, because that's just what we're going to look at next. 3. Absurdism and Community. In Arthur Schopenhauer's famous essay On the Sufferings of the World, he discusses his conviction that humanity is doomed to be miserable and frustrated in the long term. Much more than Camus, he thinks we are condemned to a specifically unhappy fate, and yet he has a consolation for us. That we are, ultimately, in it together. He suggests that if we must suffer, it is far better to recognize that this suffering is shared by all, and to greet one another not as sir or madam, but as fellow sufferer. It is not that Schopenhauer thought this was some inalienable moral duty on our part, but it was one of the ways that he thought we could learn to cope with our situation. And if we look at some of Camus' later works, we can see how he came to a similar conclusion about the ways we could confront the absurd. In The Plague and the Rebel, Camus begins to turn away from the solitary absurd hero and towards an idea of solidarity with the rest of humanity. I'll begin by outlining Camus' broad logic for asserting this, and then move on to his more fleshed out examples. The basis of Camus' argument for human solidarity is actually rather simple. It is that we are all in the same boat. The universe is no more meaningless for you than it is for me, and so Camus infers that there will be a natural sense of solidarity between us when we both become aware of this fact. We also just see him become increasingly skeptical of the mere ability of a solitary agent to withstand the difficulties and sufferings of the absurd all by themselves. As we have already seen with Clément, the later Camus often sees absurdity as something that can easily crush an individual, but may have a harder time with a group of people who are standing shoulder to shoulder with one another. Lastly, as illustrated by characters like Caligula, Camus increasingly thought that an open hostility towards other people is likely to transform what could be a joyful rebellion against the absurd into rage, hatred, and spite. It is not that he thinks this is objectively wrong, but rather it will simply make the person miserable. They will remain an absurd hero in a minimal sense, since they will be fully recognizing the existence of the absurd and will be holding it forever in their consciousness, but they have an unsuccessful strategy. one that will plunge their consciousness into despair. This theme of solidarity probably comes out most strongly in The Plague, where a vicious disease hits the town of Oran in Algeria. The tale follows Dr. Ryu and a series of volunteers as they attempt to keep the ravages of the plague at bay, largely unsuccessfully. This novel has been read as an allegory for the German occupation of France or an analysis of life's sufferings, but The Plague also represents the difficulties brought by the specific recognition of the absurd, and the volunteers are in a fruitless battle against this meaninglessness of existence and the unhappiness that it brings. And it is worth noting, when the characters are separated, either physically or emotionally, they often do fall into despair. They wonder what the point of carrying on is, and are intensely skeptical that they will have any impact on the plague's advance. But when they are together, and perceive themselves as part of a wider battle with the absurd, they begin to find some joy and even a little bit of peace, despite the fact that they are objectively no closer to victory. In one very poignant scene, Dr. Ryu spends an evening with his friend and fellow volunteer, Jean Tarou. They share some drinks, talk, open up to one another, and generally feel an underlying sense of unity, that they are on the same side against the plague. This is possibly the happiest chapter in the novel, despite its tragic undertones, because it offers a glimmer of hope. Now, it seems Camus thinks it is in companionship and solidarity that we can not only become absurd heroes, but avoid the kind of self-destructive absurdism of someone like Caligula. This theme is expanded on further in The Rebel, where Camus asks how we can have a sense of justice in an absurd world. How is it that we can rediscover our willingness to help others and save them from harm if there is no transcendent good in doing so? And again, Camus wants us to start with the idea that we are all facing the same problem. We are all people crying out for objective meaning from a cold, uncaring universe. But that also immediately gives us one thing we definitely have in common with all other people: this simple fact of our absurdity. From here, Camus says that the natural way to deal with the absurd is then not to divide ourselves, but to unite around this truth. This not only entails a sort of empathy and respect towards every human being, since we're all in the same predicament, but also a wish to preserve and protect one another. Again, this is not from any transcendent moral law, but rather the simple empathetic emotion that arises from realizing how similar we all are, existentially speaking. This is one reason why Camus condemns any course of action which seeks to treat someone as less than human. This would undermine the very foundations upon which he thinks we can resist despair. It thus not only harms others, but actually harms ourselves. It is also here that Camus expands upon his earlier idea of revolting or rebelling against the absurd. Especially for later Camus, to be an absurdist was not just to accept the absurd, but also to rebel against the suffering it causes, both to yourself and to others. This theme is definitely there in The Myth of Sisyphus and in The Stranger. After all, Meursault does not just sit there and allow a priest to lecture him before his execution, he accuses that priest of lying and throws him out of his cell. He does recognise that the way the court morally condemns him is unjustified, and that the people there are hypocrites, even if he doesn't call this wrong in some higher objective sense. There has always been this component of resistance in absurdism, but now it extends beyond simply pointing out deception and hypocrisy to embracing all humanity as your fellow absurdists and joining in a kind of universal revolt. It is now a very universalist philosophy, and this heavily contrasts with Camus' earlier solitary absurd heroes. And in some ways, this is a very natural progression in his philosophy, and it also resolves some of the tensions that arose in Caligula. Camus realized that if all he wanted people to do was to be actively aware and conscious of the absurd, yet also continue to live, this would lay the groundwork for Caligulas to arise. This is often something that's skimmed over in popular presentations of Camus, my own very much included. If there are no values, there are no moral values either, and Camus was well aware of this. There is a reason why his early protagonists are often killers. So his later works then answer a question that is set up by his earlier ones. If The Stranger asked, how should someone in isolation act if they are fully aware of the absurd, The Plague and The Rebel ask, how should people as a whole act if they are all fully conscious of the absurd? And far from dissolving into chaos and a war of all against all, Camus recommended a universal solidarity that is, ironically, reminiscent of a lot of world religions. If Christianity draws its universalism from the idea that we are all children of God, Camus draws his from the thought that we are all victims of the absurd, and that this lends us the natural alliance that any people resisting a common enemy would almost inevitably have. And it is this natural alliance that he draws attention to in many of his later works. But lastly, I want to make a more general point about Camus' philosophy, and the way in which many people, including myself, have oversimplified it. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon to get access to occasional exclusive content. The link is in the description. 4. The Trivialization of Albert Camus. In some ways, every great thinker in history is caricatured and oversimplified in presentations like mine. We can see this in Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and even the incompleteness proofs of Gödel. And yet I do think that it is particularly egregious in the case of Camus because it so often trivializes his observations. An awful lot of the time, his philosophy is boiled down to life is meaningless, but just like, don't care about it, man. And I have certainly been guilty of this myself. The nugget of truth in this is that Camus did think that the meaninglessness of life was not a reason to despair. To paraphrase Camus himself, just because existence is absurd does not mean that it is tragic. But this also empties his work of an awful lot of its content. It gets the gist of things, and I do think it gets them correctly, but I also think we do Camus a real disservice if we just stop there. For one thing, it makes Camus look like he would endorse things he was most certainly opposed to. For example, he was a member of the French resistance during the German occupation of France in World War II, and he wrote not only against the actions of his regime, but also its very philosophy. He saw him as saying, if life is meaningless, then we may as well just dominate one another. And he saw this as antithetical to his own way of approaching the absurd. He did not want us to use life's emptiness as an excuse to give in to our hatred and spite, but instead as the impetus to recognize the arbitrariness of the differences which separate us. How the deepest truth about every single human being is that we are condemned to wrestle with the absurd, and that we can embrace the natural communal feeling that comes with this. The possibility of someone like Caligula to rightly call themselves an absurdist was not something Camus seemed to like about his earlier philosophy, but was instead a flaw that he himself pointed out and then endeavored to fix in the whole rest of his work. I think part of the trouble is that in the popular sphere, Camus' earlier works are much more well known than his later writings. The Stranger remains a classic, and the phrase, "we must imagine Sisyphus happy," appears all over the internet as both a recognition of life's lack of inherent meaning and our ability to find joy despite this. But this does mean that the dominant image of Camus remains that of the individual absurdist, standing alone both against a meaningless world, but also against those who refuse to acknowledge that fact. And as a result, I think our popular conception of Camus leaves unsolved the very problems he devoted his later career to tackling. On the other hand, I don't think Camus' later philosophy is totally at odds with his earlier thinking, as some have supposed. The key problem of the absurd remains. All that changes is Camus' recommended means of tackling it. Camus eventually concluded that we were better off facing it as one shared and united humanity rather than as discrete individuals, and he ultimately thought to be cruel or brutal to one another was to display a limited understanding of the absurd and its natural consequences. It is to treat absurdity as if it was some unique curse, rather than something faced by all people at all times. It is not that he thought the solitary approach was wrong in the same way a moralist might, but he thought it reflected the clouded judgment of that particular absurdist. Like the earlier version of Camus himself, they had not yet brought their conclusion to full fruition. Ultimately, I think that a good way to approach Camus' philosophy is to see him balancing two concerns that are forever kept in tension. John Foley calls these freedom and justice, but I would rather put it as freedom of action and communal solidarity, since justice can make it seem like Camus is posing some transcendent value. On the one hand, Camus clearly enjoys the radical freedom that a recognition of the absurd opens up. This freedom to create your own life and exist how you please is part of why he prefers the absurdist life to one where we do believe in absolute values. But he is also aware that this opens up a problem. Because if we allow every course of action to take place, then we are tacitly endorsing the kind of wanton destruction that Caligula enacted in Camus' play. It would deny Camus the ability to say that the German occupation of France was worth resisting. So then he has to introduce the opposing concept, solidarity. This solidarity is a way of reconstructing mutual respect and regard between people in the absence of transcendent values. Hence his argument for a natural sense of shared humanity, since we are all forever struggling against the absurd. And it's also the balance between these two factors which leads to Camus' signature sense of epistemic humility. In his works, especially from The Rebel onwards, he becomes increasingly skeptical of attempts to enforce many values on other people beyond the minimal amount required to protect this sense of solidarity. He heavily criticizes what he calls utopian visions for the future of society, where we're promised a perfect world at some unspecified point in the future if only we allow for just a little bit of authoritarianism now. He rejects any attempt to draw metaphysical or absolute divisions between people, or to see some as immutably enemies and some as immutably allies. He recognizes that conflict will occur and is sometimes necessary, but he is clear that this is never something to be celebrated, but instead seen as a deep tragedy, a wound in the potential unity of all mankind. These opposing tensions in Camus' philosophy also means that absurdism is not a simple solution to existential dread. The appropriate balance between freedom and solidarity are going to be different in different situations, and for Camus, the absurd cannot be solved in advance. It is for each of us to figure out for ourselves. To live in full awareness of the absurd and yet neither despair nor lose that sense of solidarity that Camus thinks is so essential to surviving life, that is the task that Camus assigns to us. Imagining Sisyphus happy is not a single action of acceptance and resignation, but is rather maintained through a constant, agonizing, active philosophy of life. To me, that is what Camus' absurdism represents, and it is a far richer idea than many of us associate with this unique French thinker. But if you want to explore one of Camus' darkest tales, then click here to watch my analysis of his brilliant novel, The Plague. I hope you enjoyed this video and have a wonderful day.